More people than I expected. Not a bad thing. But what we're going to do, did everybody get one of these? I can make more copies before you go. This is a kind of the class outline. So the aim or the intent of this class and the subsequent classes will be to kind of bring us up through history. We're going to start with Roman rule, the destruction of the Jewish temple. Then we're going to go to Byzantine Christianity. Then we're going to go to the Islamic conquest and Umayyad rule, the Crusaders and the Latin kingdoms, Ottoman rule, the British Mandate and Zionism, and that will take us to modern Jerusalem. And I think we'll give you a better understanding of, you're not going to understand what's going on totally in the Holy Land. But I think you will have a better idea of how history has affected what is going on in that country today. So anybody want to guess why we're starting with Roman rule? Yes, that is one of the reasons. I love Roman history and I prefer to start with the Romans. Well, Rome's coming into its dominance. Israel hasn't really been in control of its own destiny for quite some time. But it has, for the longest time, been in the influence of Eastern empires and Eastern kingdoms. Now, it is being folded in to the West and folded into something very unique for its time, and that is the Roman Empire. So when we talk about Israel and we talk about Rome, we begin with a pretty famous person. Does anyone want to guess who first kind of conquered Israel for Rome? Pompey the Great, which was part of Julius Caesar's first triumvirate. So Pompey the Great, he kind of earns the great title from his Eastern conquests. He really makes a name for himself when he goes out east. And he does something that you are really not supposed to do that really upset the people of Israel. Does anyone want to guess what he, besides conquering them? I mean, that was more forgivable than what he did after he conquered them. Yeah, but how? He went in there. He went in to look at the Holy of Holies to see what was back there. That's all he did. He was told, you can't go in there. That is God's resting place. You know, only the high priest could go in there. And very limited amount of times during the year. But Pompey goes back. And this, I think, for us to understand what will be happening throughout the course of history, here to today, is the dissonance between empire and religion. The Romans cannot get it through their minds how someone could only believe and worship one God. That's bonkers to them. You know, they have people they have plenty of clients who will worship Roman gods as well as their own. But the Israelites refuse. And they have these very strict rules about how they can worship, what they can eat, what they can do. And this is kind of like, almost you have to think of like aliens in some way meeting for the first time. These are people who operate just with a completely different understanding and a different worldview. That the great sacrilege doesn't necessarily come in the conquering, but when Pompey decides to go into the Holy of Holies. That Israel itself is so used to being passed from empire to empire that the idea that they have a new ruler is not something really that alarming or earth-shattering for them. It is when Pompey goes into the temple itself. And this is going to continue to be an issue for the people of Israel, for Jews. This is going to become an issue for Christians, and it will become an issue for Muslims, that they will all kind of congregate and see certain places in the holy city as sacrosanct, that cannot be touched, that cannot be defiled. And those kind of boundaries will constantly be crossed. So not only producing kind of visceral responses of conquering and of empire, but also of religion. But this brings Israel into the sphere of Rome. And this occurs in 63 BCE. So BCE is the before Common Era, all right, or BC, before Christ. So 63 BCE. How far away are we from Jesus at this point? Yeah, Jesus probably born sometime 60 years later, 63 years later. The crucifixion will be somewhere, 90 to 100 years from when Rome conquers. So when Jesus is born, he is born into a world that has been under Roman control for about 60 to 70 years, okay? So one of the things Rome does is it doesn't like to rule directly. It likes to have clients, client kings. So they will find someone of the people to rule them, to kind of give that semblance, Rome's thing is pay your taxes and we'll leave you alone. As long as you pay your taxes, you're good. So they entrust rule around the year 37 to a very infamous character, Herod the Great. What do we know about Herod? We need to go back to the gospel classes before we. Very good. And what is he famous for or infamous for? The murder of the innocents. So this prophet of Messiah is going to be born, and Herod has all babies under all male children under a certain age killed. Does anyone know the famous quote by Caesar, by Augustus? Better to be a Herod's pig than his son. Herod had a bit of a streak of paranoia, and he had many of his sons executed for fear that they would try to depose him or replace him. So, and religiously, purity laws, what can you not do to a pig if you're a Jew? Eat it, so you wouldn't kill it. So I thought Augustus had a pretty good line there. I'd rather be a pig in Herod's court than a child. So. But Herod is also well known for doing something else, and that is rebuilding the temple. Okay? It had been destroyed once, it had been rebuilt, it had kind of been desecrated when Rome comes back in, but it is still not what it was. Not what it was when Solomon built it. So Herod, who is an Edomite by birth, he's not a Judean, decides that he's going to have this great campaign to raise money and to rebuild the temple. And not just good, but great, grand, wonderful. All the bells and whistles, pours untold amount of wealth to rebuilding the temple. And this kind of makes him a figure that is both feared but also respected. Because for many of you who have come to some of my other classes, maybe particularly the Mark class, you'll remember how important the temple is. Temple worship, the temple is the center of religious life. It is their identity with it. Okay, it is God's dominion, it is where God resides on earth. Okay, so this isn't just your church. The temple is not just a church to them, it is the literal place to them where God exists on earth. You need to internalize to be able to better understand what it is that is about to happen to them. Okay, so Herod rebuilds the temple. Beautiful, it's wonderful. And then there comes what I would say is the first shot across the bow when it comes to religious conflicts. And this isn't Jesus's fault, and I'm not saying Jesus fired first, but Jesus makes claims about the temple that will become very inflammatory in the early church between early Christians and the Jews. We're going to read from John chapter 2, verses 16 through 22. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days." But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. 30 to 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, the temple will in fact be destroyed. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about the first Roman-Jewish war in a minute. But why do you think Jesus's words here would create such tension between Jews and the early Christians? Okay. Well, yeah, the temple is important. Yeah, there's a huge element of an identity crisis that will be had when the temple is destroyed again. And you intersect that with the early churches carrying around the words of Jesus that destroy this temple in 3 days, I will build it again. What does Jesus say? What are the followers of the way? We have to remember the early Christians are not Christians. They are Jews who are followers of the way. Okay? They do not identify as Christians who follow the way. Okay? Why would these words of Jesus have such an impact in the wake of the destruction? I think in some ways it provides validation for the followers for the early church. Jesus predicted his death and his resurrection. Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. These things have occurred. And in some ways, the church, the early Christians, the followers of the way, can now claim that they are the descendants, they are the continuation. The temple is destroyed. Now it is carried on in the gospel, right? It's almost as if the temple has been removed, Jesus is risen. Okay? So whereas there's contention between Jewish elite persecuting people of the early church, after the destruction of the temple and the expulsion of the Jews in another 70 years, the power dynamic is going to shift. And one of the main points of contention, or one of the main arguments of the early churches, Jesus said this was going to happen, and it did. Okay? So there is this intersection right now in the life of Jesus of that religious conflict beginning. Not to say there wasn't internal religious conflict within the Jewish society before that, but to understand what is happening today, it is important to take note that Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and speaks of himself as being that. Okay? Any questions before we go on to the Roman Jewish? How is one remembered? What is one's legacy? To build big things, build great things, to have, as a Roman client, you are not going to make your name going out. Herod could not have raised an army to go out. It's not in his purview at the time. But he could, you know, outside of David, Solomon is, a king on Mount Rushmore, just behind it. So to kind of solidify himself as a great king of Israel, rebuilt the temple. And one thing Rome does do well, if people are willing to pay the tax, is it does provide a certain amount of stability. Whether you like being under the yoke of the Roman Empire or not, those who pay their taxes do experience levels of stability that they probably did not have. So things like great architectural undertakings are possible in periods like this. No. Well, I think that's another thing we're going to discover over the course of 2000 years, is that people haven't really changed that. Jesus makes the prediction about the temple in John well before he himself is arrested. So the Gospels only have Jesus going to Jerusalem at the end of his ministry. John will have Jesus back now quite a bit, but whenever it happens before his arrest. No, for John, the disciples are always reflecting back on Jesus' words for them to make. So what do any of you know anything about the first Roman Jewish war? So outside of the Holocaust, there's probably one certain event in the Jewish Roman war that hangs as like an amber in the mind of the people of Israel today. It's the siege of Masada. But things that kind of lead up to the Jewish war. Why do a lot of wars start? Territory, I would say in areas of cloak. There's one. Say what you want about the American Revolution. It started as a tax. That was how it began. All right. The Jewish-Roman War conflict, the temperature, why things will continue to get more and more tense is because of taxes. Okay? Rome is requiring very steep levies of tax at this point. Right? Nobody likes paying more in taxes. Right? That's the surest way not to get elected. Tell people they're going to have to pay more. Caligula is the emperor around this time. He's a bit off. What a guy. Not the most stable of leaders. He wants a statue of himself put in the temple. So you have tax, which probably upsets a good deal of people. Then you have the desecration of the temple with Caligula wanting to put a graven image of himself inside. You have now done what? Upset the religious stuff, the religious. And there is also a great deal of class tension in Israel itself, specifically against the religious elite in Jerusalem and the peasants outside. This is particularly important because in the Jewish-Roman War, the first time the city is kind of captured in the war is by the peasants outside capturing Jerusalem kind of for themselves. Okay? So Jerusalem is the center of power, is the seat of power. And when the peasants kind of, the lower socioeconomic groups kind of start their rebellion against Rome, they see the elites as in league or in bed with them. So they basically conquered Jerusalem for themselves. Right? So it is no longer the elite who are kind of in bed with Rome that are there. It is kind of peasant, lower economic level who have now kind of worked their way. Then Rome comes. The one thing about Rome is if you paid your taxes, they generally left you alone. But what is Rome also notorious for? Oppression. I would say, oppression, I would say they're brutal overreaction to life. If you upset their stability and their tax base, they are going to match the base. And what they didn't expect was how zealous the Jews would fight, especially in and around Jerusalem. So it is a very bloody. And what happens in bloody conflicts, especially ones that aren't expected? What happens to soldiers? Well, they die, but what about their psyche? I think a certain amount of anger, resentment, rage builds up. So Titus controlled armies at this time. Upon reaching the first wall, in the second, getting into the temple area, Josephus, the famous Jewish Roman historian who's there at the time, says the command is given, they should now demolish the entire city. So Rome has kind of been worked up in such a blood fever that they essentially dismantle the entire thing. Okay? There is nothing in our lives, in our world, that can compare to what has just happened. Okay? If somebody blew up the White House, it would not touch what has happened. I mean, the White House was destroyed in what? Were they 12? British burned it down or whatever. Who really remembers that? Like, I mean, most people, that's not like this is a traumatic event. Faith, the people of Israel, is of central importance. In the center of that, their very understanding of what it means to be the chosen people of God is that God resides with them. Now, God's residing place, God's home, has been destroyed. What do you think this does to a people? Well, there's definitely some rage. Yeah. Which the conflict between Rome and Israel is not over. Hopeless? Yeah, I mean, the tragedy. Historians say close to 1 million Jews were killed in this war. Your faith has now been burned down, stoned. If you just think through the life of the Old Testament, ever since God leads the people out of slavery in the 12th tabernacle, there when the temple fell after they conquered that territory and made it their own. One of the things that we're going to talk about a lot more in 1900s and the 2000s is the idea of what? Zionism. That's one of those primary beliefs in Zionism. The reestablishing of the nation of Israel, which the pinnacle of that is what? The rebuilding of the temple. That is a central understanding of many people today, many people that are involved in this conflict. The idea that the nation of Israel must be reinstated and the temple must be. And that trauma is 2,000 years old. It is something that they've carried around with them, these people, as part of their identity. Okay? This is why, in order to understand conflict there today, you have to start at least Roman. Because a lot of those grievances, a lot of those desires, a lot of those wants, those dreams, these prophetic apocalyptic views of what is to come exists in this place. And the church itself is not separate from it. What do we hear about descending in the book of Revelation? The New Jerusalem, the city itself is named. And it says in the book of Revelation, God will dwell with his people, the very thing that the temple is. God dwelling with the people. This is central to their understanding of who they are as people. It is religious, it is secular, it is all these things. But here, this trauma is massive. Okay? You know, all the high holy days, all the things they get from the Old Testament, this hangs, I would say, just as fresh in the mind. Destruction. Because in another 70, 80 years, after there is another revolt, Rome is going to expel all the Jews. This is where you get the diaspora. Okay? Why there are a lot of Jews in Europe. This is, you know, a lot of the people who've come back to live in there, people whose families probably had to leave in 130 to 150 CE AD. All right? So the temple is destroyed, the conflict continues, and just to kind of put a stamp on the trauma and kind of the end of the war, I brought up the siege of Masada. So I'm going to read you, this is apparently a speech that was given by one of the military leaders of Masada as it was being besieged by the Romans. Brave and loyal followers, long ago we resolved to serve neither the Romans nor anyone other than God himself, who alone is true and just Lord of mankind. The time has now come that bids us to prove our determination by our deeds that we have never submitted to slavery, even when it brought no danger with it. We must not choose slavery now, and with it, penalties that will mean the end of everything if we fall alive into the hands of the Roman God has given us this privilege, that we can die nobly and as free men, leave this world as free men in company with our wives and children. Apparently, after that, 967 Jewish men, women, and children chose to take their own lives before the walls were breached by the Roman Empire. So that is the tying in that I can do, that call back to the Exodus. God liberated us from slavery in Egypt, brought us out here into this promised land. We will not die slaves. 967 men. You see, this time, this war is kind of, it is part of Israel's understanding of itself. You could see why they would cling to it as part of their national identity once Israel is restored after World War II. That something like this, you know, this fervent, emphatic, you know, we would rather die than be slaves. Look what has been taken from us type thing. These two events played huge on the establishment and in the early reinstatement of the nation of Israel. Coming out of the Holocaust and all of those brutalities, the events of the destruction of the temple by the Romans, of Masada, of the rebellion, even great type things. Like this is part of their identity, just as much as the Exodus, children of the promise, all of those things. All right. Any questions about the destruction of the Jewish people? So I had a lovely picture that I had taken. I'm gonna put these slides up, and I'll probably at our next class go through the ones that I have. But the temple itself is pretty much taken stone from stone to the ground, except for what? Anybody know? Western Wall, also known as Salem. And that still remains today. There is no temple above the Wailing Wall, but there is what? The Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock, which is the traditional place in Islam where Muhammad was carried by angels and his foot was set upon a stone and he was carried off back by that, making Jerusalem the third holy city in Islam. I mean, I guess you work yourself into a fervor of tearing stuff down, and when you're done, you're done. One of the things I don't think we kind of think about is a lot of the times in antiquity into the Middle Ages, you just built on top of things, or you used things that were already there. So when you talk about archaeology in some of these cities that are, 3,000, 4,000 years old, there are layers to the city where things are built right on top of each other. And when I'm able to show you the Wailing, it is a the stones are massive. We don't build things like that. We don't. We don't care about beauty the way people do. We don't. The stones are as large as people. These are things not easily torn down, not easily moved. And it is kind of, I don't know, to be there, to touch that wall, it's something very, you're touching something very, feeling, and there, without that wall. The tradition is a lot of people will write a prayer, tuck it in the crevices of the wall. They got there at like 10 o'clock and it's already. I think they might clear it out once a day. But yeah, and to see people of all different faiths, rock kind of perched up on top. In the Dome of the Rock is another building. And at times it had crosses. After it was built, Christians never tore it down. They would just put crosses in it, and they appreciated its beauty and its grandeur. They would just fill it with Christian things. No, the Dome of the Rock is just the encasing of this holy place. But it's this nice gilded kind of dome with all these intricate mosaics, glass and colored stuff. Any more questions? Not done. I'm just trying not to answer questions about something about it. I am not a historical architect, or I mean, The structures they used, they rolled the stones, they built ramps to set them up in place. Like, I think some places it probably, some places it worked out for weeks or that stuff, like to lift those, like the amount of manpower you needed to accomplish these things is beyond fail. And slaves. All right. So the temple is destroyed, and there is this huge identity crisis. Something must shift for the people themselves when it comes to worship, right? Temple is the center of the faith. Now it's gone. The Judaism that we know today begins now. So that's the studying of the Torah, the rabbinic rabbi being kind of the center of leading worship, a teacher being the lead worship, not a high priest or anything like that. But the synagogue community life is something that begins to form and take shape. Okay? So the Judaism that exists today, the way in which their faith is practiced, evolves after the destruction of Jerusalem. Positions like the Sadducees and those things kind of drift away, anything that was tied to the temple. The Pharisees, their teachings become kind of connected with rabbinic teaching. But to say there's no hard feelings would not be the Jewish people, a lot of resentment for what has happened. Like 9/11, like a lot. This Jewish war ends sometime in the early 70s. The bar Kokhba, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Hebrew was by far my worst class in seminary, but the Bar Kokhba revolt would take place about 60 years after. And that will be a major revolt, once again, against Rome. And as Rome doesn't station huge legions in every one of its flanks, right? Small token forces just to provide some idea of presence. So there is a lot of early success. People are probably thinking, oh yeah, we're doing it. We're throwing off the yoke of the Roman Empire. It just takes a little while. And Rome moves faster than anyone else had ever been able to move before when it comes to mobilizing its forces. Rome is able to mobilize its forces under Emperor Hadrian, and 3 years after it starts, it is kind of brutally crushed. Jerusalem loses its name. Emperor Hadrian changes the name to Aelia Capitolonia. The entire region continued to be called Palestine. All Jews at this point are kind of stuck. As well. So what you have here is kind of the end of this revolt with Emperor Hadrian. You have the transition that is Jews who lived in the Holy Land for the whole long just being their home. A lot of the people that are still left were probably native to it. Yeah. there before the Romans came. Descendants might not have been Jews. There were many Christians who would have been expelled for being considered to be Jews. There are other areas where Christians wouldn't have been expelled because they weren't Jews. This isn't the age of the internet where it's easy to identify and know, what are the signs that you're a Jew or a Christian? It would have been up to whoever was enforcing it. The face of Israel, of Palestine, is now totally different than it was. Rome still exists. Rome's still in charge. When we talk about Byzantine Christianity in our next class, you should assume that it's still Roman rule. They're Christians, but they still call themselves Roman. The emperor of the Byzantine Empire called himself Emperor of Rome. Just consider them Christian. But these are kind of the major events that take place. Now I want to touch on, hopefully quickly, why is this so significant for the time, for the next era, for the next age we're going to talk about, but also for today. Already touched on the destruction of the temple, the fall of Masada as being like central to the identity of the state of Israel today. I think this also brews not a religious, but a nationalistic identity. They very much identify it is their nation. It is a religious or a racially homogenous type vision of what that would look like. But a lot of the revolts, a lot of the prophets throughout this time who will try and, restoke rebellion and revolt against the Romans will kind of lean into this kind of nationalistic language, ideology about us versus them type thing. But this has paved the way for, kind of created the space for another religion to gain dominance as well. And when Emperor Constantine will, see the Cairo and will convert to Christianity, and then the Eastern Empire itself will make Christianity the official language or the official religion of the empire, naturally, what faith will step in to claim Jerusalem as its own? Christianity. So the most iconic buildings that exist in Jerusalem will be constructed in the age to come. So anybody know any famous Christian buildings? And you guys don't know. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional place, unlikely, where Jesus was actually crucified and buried, but the traditional places believed to be where Jesus was crucified and where his tomb, there is churches built on top. Those are the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I think it's 3 different denominations have claim over the various chapels and areas, so it's kind of cool. Catholic, Orthodox, and Armenian. Could be wrong on that, exactly how that's broken up, but it's interesting to see how they all kind of coexist within that building. But the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is, I would say, if you ever wanted to go to Israel, when you go to Jerusalem, it's like Christian Disney World, all right? It's a bit much. Long lines, lots of people trying to sell you stuff. Like it could take away from the sanctity of it. But if you can find that time, as I was able to at one point for 2 minutes, kind of close yourself off from everything else going around. There is kind of like to see that as a place for 2,000 years where people went and worshiped, believing it was the place that Jesus was crucified. Is, there's a holiness to that. So those are the ways that kind of we're setting up the next kind of area. One of the things that I found interesting when I went to Israel is we met with a Lutheran pastor, a Palestinian Lutheran pastor, Mitri Rahab. And one of the things that he said that was really striking to me was ethnically and racially, he shares much more ethnically and racially with his ancestors of people in the Old Testament than the Jews who now live in Israel. I thought that was odd, and I had to think about it for a while. But what has occurred with the expulsion of the Jews is a lot of them have been dispersed to other parts of the world and other parts of Europe. So a lot of Jewish people who live, a lot of people who live in Israel now are ethnically a lot more European than they are kind of Semitic or Middle Eastern. A lot of the Palestinians who live there have ethnically, Semitic kind of racially kind of homogenous with people who say, when you look at a Palestinian, that's probably what a Israelite would have looked at around the time of Jesus or before. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Like ethnically, Jews have a lot more European blood as they begin to come back, as opposed to Palestinians who are Semitic. So that kind of identity, that racial ethnic identity begins to change, which feels weird. I don't like talking about it, but I think it's important for us when kind of viewing what is going to be happening over the years with Jews coming back, with Palestinians being expelled for various reasons, in the Caliphate, when Salah ad-Din comes in, like there's going to be a lot of mixing of ethnicities and races, but it kind of has, I think it's important to keep in mind that Israelis today are ethnically European. Palestinians are more ethnically Semitic. Palestinians being the ones who probably look more like Jesus as opposed to the Israelis who live there today. Am I making sense? Okay, I'm trying.
This country was integrated. New York City, for example, was melting pot.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, I can't really use America. But you could say if you wanted to use an American view of things, Palestinians would be more Native American. Israelis would be more colonial European. In today's kind of thing. Yeah. And it's not that simple. And there are people who are Israeli who are still very Semitic and ethnically, who do kind of still look very have that Middle Eastern look as opposed to a more European look. Another thing that's going to happen that I think is very important for us to understand is that when we shift into the Christian era, it is no longer going to be about suppression, but about patronage. All right. So Israelites, Jews in Rome became the enemy of Rome. When Christianity is adopted and Jerusalem becomes this holy place, instead of being a place that was having money pulled out and was being bled over, it's going to be a place that's going to have money pouring in. All right. So there's going to be this big change, but Rome's influence doesn't. It's just desire of what to do with this city and what it likes about it or wants from it will shift. And it's interesting to note that that shift is a religious one that will make imperial decisions. The empire itself will be changed by this religious shift. But the imperial view of Palestine and of Jerusalem will be changed by a religious shift. So one of the things that we're going to touch on a lot is, is it religion's fault that everything's such a mess over there? Yes, absolutely. No, not at all. People are the problem. The issues there would exist because people are involved. All right. There are very powerful religious convictions that play into some of the conflicts. But as we're going to see, a lot of the things that happen and occur in this time have very human motivations that have nothing to do with religion whatsoever. I would say the same thing exists today. There are still those religious dynamics, but a lot of human motivations that have nothing to do with religion whatsoever. Somebody raise their hand. Also, what's going to begin to change is Roman conviction for the Holy City, but the geopolitics of everything is going to begin to change. As Rome's power is still kind of climbing or still in its heyday after 130, 150, but it will begin to decline, which will open it up once again to the east when we have the return of the Eastern empires, the Umayyads after that, the Caliphate, and Muslims. So we're getting ready. It's important to understand that geopolitically, Israel, Turkey, that kind of area, that far eastern end of Europe, Asia, is where two different worlds are going to meet for a long time. Rome had always had ambitions beyond Palestine to all the riches out east. But every time it wandered just a little bit too far, its armies were annihilated. And the same thing could be said of those in the east. They always want to cross into Turkey and keep going to see everything out there in the west, but never make it. So areas like Turkey, like Syria, like Israel, Palestine are going to be those flashpoints where East and West are going to constantly meet. And the time for that is getting ready to come. Rome, in its power, with its wealth, with its military resources, was always going to be able, at this time, to be able to push back. But that is going to their power and influence is going to begin to wane, which is going to bring the East back into play, which would kind of reintroduce the kind of other character in this, which would be, which will be the Muslims from a religious point of view, but Eastern empires, modern day Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all those nations, Egypt, will come back on to the scene. Just want to make sure there wasn't. All right. That's where we're going to leave this class for today. In our next class, we're going to do, like I said, Byzantine Christian Jerusalem, which will be roughly 320 years. So that'll be the conversion of Constantine, the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but probably from a religious point of view, will become a huge point of contention going forward. Is all of a sudden, pilgrimage becomes this really cool thing. huge money trap, but it will also be the idea that you could go and be baptized in the Jordan, pray where Jesus prayed. Began to have such a draw and such a pull that it will pull the Western European states back into being very interested on what was happening on this far side of the world. Whereas when the Western Roman Empire kind of falls away, go kind of dark for a little bit, but they will have a renewed interest because of things like pilgrimages. So any questions? So the years from tonight, Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 63, and the temple's destroyed in 70 CE, and then the end of that second revolt, Simon Kabar, is 135. So 63 CE or 63 BCE, about 135 CE. What else maybe do you think could be seen or felt in today's conflict just from this period of history? I would say there's one factor, something Rome does that had happened before, but will continue to be the issue going forward. I would say it's outsiders thinking they know what's best. Outsiders making the decisions for people who live there. That will continue to be an issue. And I would say one of the greatest sources of contention and conflict in the modern era is because outsiders thought they knew what they were doing and didn't. The Allies, after seeing everything that took place, thought they were making a great decision, and they didn't know what they were doing. So I think that idea of not having control is going to be the constant state or the constant feeling for most people that actually live there. And that should be something we should kind of try and remember. Like a lot of who's in charge, who's wearing the crown, whose name's printed on things will change quite a lot. But the people who live there kind of remain the same to some degrees. And they will just be kind of at the whims of whoever their new rulers will be.
Is it right to say or generalize what you said there, that it's meaningful?
I mean, I think ultimately what a lot of these things boil down to is there's a lot of wealth to be had in this point. So where East and West meet is also a fantastic place to trade. A lot of wealth. There's a lot of wealth. I think you can motivate the masses with religion to fulfill, for rulers to kind of fulfill their own selfish aims, desires, which is something I think will happen quite a bit. Any other questions? Was this informative? All right. So I will get these slides posted, and it should not take me 2 weeks to figure out why this isn't working. But we'll do Byzantine Christian Jerusalem, and we'll really start kind of laying the groundwork for the three-headed beast, because 638 is when the Islamic conquest comes. So the transition I will leave you with after the next class is Roman Christianity is on its way out. Islamic conquest is here. Now all three players have kind of taken the stage in terms of from a religious point. All right. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Mr. Brad, I had a question. Had you done that class on forgiveness yet? 'Cause I
No.
know I haven't been. Okay.
That'll be, so we'll